Good evening, everyone. Time for episode 25 of the Drums of Doom, starting on page 307, 19 October 2020. We'll reread a few paragraphs to catch up. Okay. All right. Karina went from one sword to the other, her right hand touching her chin, considering. Then I claim the sword of the north wind, Karina said. If we make it through this, we're sure to end up in the frigid Northland again, and I will be ready. Taking up the weapon, she ran her sword belt through the scabbard loop, set it over her left hip, and tested its weight. Satisfied, she grasped its hilt in her right hand and then drew her sword in a lightning-fast draw. It's a fine blade. Sheathing it, she smiled broadly. And now you must claim the ring as well, Tao said. You now carry the weapons of the guardian of the north wind. Wield them well, my love. I shall. And what about you, Tao? Carmen asked. I shall wait until last, he said. My father's magic will have to stand our tests until then. Then Dartin and Leander have the greatest need, Carmen said. You first, Dartin, Leander said. Somehow I believe that I shall find Atran Daru again some day. In the meantime, we both need to stay alive, Dartin observed. I choose the ring of and sword of the south wind. Placing the ring upon the ring finger of his left hand, he was surprised when it suddenly shrank to fit him, neither too tight nor too loose. He was relieved when he found that he could still remove it. Exchanging his old scabbard for the new one, he too carried his sword over his left hip. This is a great sword, and I swear by Odin that I will carry it with honor. Only 2 swords remain, Leander. Which will you choose? There is only one choice, the sword of the east wind. The sword of the west wind is for Carmen alone. Fastening it over his right hip, he placed the ring upon the index finger of his right hand. He then lashed his old sword to the side of his pack. Our old swords are still good weapons. We must not abandon them. Perhaps Tao should take it, Carmen said. Nay, my lady, Tao replied. A paladin should have a holy blade. The sword of the west wind must surely be one of the greatest among them. I will carry it with honor. Wearing it in like fashion, she placed the ring upon the ring finger of her right hand and belted her old sword across her back. And what of the other items? The potion of expansion could be used by anyone, Tao said, in the right circumstances. Perhaps you should hold on to it, Kaelor said, until we need it. Very well. But the warrior's potion should go to Kerr. Once he drinks it, he will become battle's juggernaut. I don't trust it. But if the time comes, I will try it, Kerr grumbled. And to Kaelor, a Noma's shield and mace. The shield only, Kaelor said. The mace is too heavy. You hold on to it, Tao. Okay, but let me know if you should want it. If I carry any more weapons, I won't be able to move properly. A thief needs to be silent. Altogether, Tarek said, we have almost 5,000 gold coins. There is no telling how so much wealth might help us. That's about 600 apiece, Kaelor said. Too much for most of us to carry. Then take what you will, Tarek urged. But I'm taking the 600. And I can manage a little more, Kerr said. Me too, Dartin said. I have never felt so strong. There is a change in you, Carmen said. How do you feel? I feel fine. Better than fine, even. It's strange, but I haven't felt hungry at all since I put the armor on. We've got to find a way to free you of it, Carmen said worriedly. There are spells that could help, Tao said, and maybe even remove the curse upon it. If only we had one. We'll just have to wait and see. Let us rest, Carmen said, and see if our wizards can open this door for us. There's a spell in Modrul's book that should prove effective. Then sleep and study quickly, Carmen said. We need to keep moving and hope that we find food. They awoke with uplifted spirits, better armed than ever before and for the most part unhurt. They packed with newfound vigor. Before them loomed the portal, magically barred, thick-beamed, and iron-bound. "Well, wizards," Carmen said, "how do you expect to get us through?" Modrul has provided us with a possible solution. We used his spell for opening in Modrul's lair, but his spell for barring a portal remained, Dal explained. I don't understand how that can help us. Based upon his spell, I designed my own spell of opening, and Kayla and I penned it into his own book. I should be able to memorize and evoke its power at will. But will it work? I have no idea. We could try and hack the door down. That would take hours, and then every creature within a mile will know that we're here. Cast your spell down. Stand back, everyone. There is no telling what might happen with an untested formula. Standing before the door, he stilled his mind, finding the center of his power. Lifting his hands before himself, he traced the outline of the door and then began his incantation. With his will, he raised his power. In a sense, he battled against the magical energy placed upon the portal by the ancient wizard who long ago sealed the room shut. While the struggle ensued, the ancient runes became visible to all, one by one, as Tao vied against them. In the midst of casting, he had fully entered into the realm of his mind, and his hands would often reach for the phantom symbols as if to catch one and cast it away. At first, it seemed that the flood of the ancient wizard's enchantments would be too much, but Tao only concentrated all the harder, and soon he turned the tide. Ostium, de lignum, de saxum, de ferrum, libero tuos, teneo apertos, ille via permitto omnis et ingredior. Open the way, allow all to enter. It was then that the final rune was banished, and for an instant the seams of the door burst with light. The ancient locking mechanism spun and clicked, tumbled and turned. Rotating slowly, the doorknob released its aged grasp, and the portal swung open just a crack. Tao turned to them all, quite relieved and sweating more than a little. That old wizard was tough, he declared. But you were tougher, Carmen said, quite impressed. My father was a good teacher. He would often invent games to develop my concentration. Now I can focus on just one thing at a time, excluding all else. That type of discipline is what is required to win a contest between wizards. Well, Karina said, we should be off to find some food then. One more spell. Producing one of his father's daggers, he enchanted its blade with magical light. Should we need it, Tao said, we will have the light of 100 candles to show us the way. Sheathing it, its light was extinguished, yet ever ready. How long will your light last, Kerr said. Unless I end it or another wizard disenchants it, it will still be as bright for hundreds of years after we're all gone. That could come in handy, indeed. For now, Carmen said, we go forth in the dark, with what stealth that we can muster. Kalor, lead the way. Tarek, you have rear guard. Kerr grasped the edge of the great door, leaned back and pulled. It was massive, over a foot thick and iron-bound, and its hinges rusty. Nevertheless, it was no match for the determined strength of a grumpy dwarf, and Kerr soon had it open. Kalor slipped through into the deepening darkness. The next room was an antechamber, some 20 feet square, at the far end of which an open archway stood. The arch framed the entryway of a set of massively constructed stairs heading west, sized for giants, it would seem. They would have to climb or jump down each one. Kalor waited for Carmen to catch up. Maybe we should turn back and try the other way. Let's try it, Carmen whispered, and see where it leads. Just be careful and keep your eyes open. Using his training in acrobatics, he worked his way down step by step, quickly developing a rhythm that propelled him gracefully to the bottom. He descended some 90 stairs in all, traveling well over 300 feet in distance and in depth. There was a small chamber at the bottom, ending with yet another thick door of at least 9 feet in height. It was there that he discovered some grisly remains. A skeletal hand, with wrist and forearm bones still attached to it, grasped the hilt of a rusty dagger, embedded into the face of the door, at a height of about 5 feet. There were a few words scratched into the wood just above it, but he would need some light to read them. The doorknob and keyhole was centered upon the left side of it, too high for him to examine properly without jumping up or climbing on something, or some dwarf. Leaping up and grabbing the knob was too risky. Better to wait for help. Turning about, he looked up the stairs. He could still see Carmen and the others framed with light in the doorway above. But could they see him? He doubted it. But Carmen and Dartin might, if they were using their helms to the fullest. He waved up to them to see if they reacted, and not surprisingly, Carmen waved back. "Come down," he signaled, and she gave him a thumbs up. Returning to the task, he began to search the small room that he was standing in. If there was a trap, he aimed to find it. When they finally made it down to him, he was sure that the door was not rigged, but he needed to see the keyhole in order to be certain. "Can you give me a lift?" he asked Kerr. "Of course," he whispered. 10 fingers. Lacing his fingers together, Kerr created a basket for Kayla to step in and hoisted him up with ease. Peering into the keyhole proved fruitless, because the wood was cold and damp, and his night vision could see only a little. "Dow," Kayla said, "this would be a great time for some of your light." Dow immediately drew out his dagger, and the room was brilliantly illuminated. The disembodied hand then seemed even more sinister, and the words that it had carved were visible to all. "Turn back. Do not pass beyond the door. Death awaits." "Apparently he didn't have time to finish it," Dow observed. "It is written in Elvish, but what elf would dare tread about down here?" "We have no way of knowing if it was an elf," Carmen said, "or even a he or a she, but we may have no choice but to enter." "We could backtrack and try the other passage." "There is no way of knowing if one way is any more dangerous than another," Tarek reasoned. "The 2 passageways might just connect somewhere farther in." "What of the door, Kalor?" "I have found no signs of any trap, and it appears to be unlocked." "As if," Leander said, "we are being welcomed in." "More likely," Dartin said, "whoever wrote this was the last person to come through here." "But what killed him?" Karina asked. "The bones are sliced cleanly," Tarek said. "My guess would be that he died by the sword." "More likely whatever killed him is still down here and waiting," Kerr said grimly. "That's comforting," Karina said. "It just seems right, considering the way that our luck's been going." "Well, Kalor," Carmen said, "which way does the diamond point now?" Climbing down from his perch, he pulled the gem out of his pack. Indisputably, it pointed to somewhere beyond the door. "Lead on," she said with a sigh. Grasping the doorknob with 2 hands, she turned and pulled. The door then opened with ease. Massively constructed with thick beams and enormous iron hinges, it should have required quite a pull to move it, but rather it swung inward so easily that it seemed to have no weight to it at all. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" "No," Kayla said matter-of-factly. "It's incredible workmanship." "Dwarves might have made it," Kerr said, caressing the surface. "But I have heard of ancient elven craftsmen whose magic allowed them to craft doors such as this." Dow allowed his light to fall inward as they opened the door, and lo, a great hallway, running north and south, loomed before them. The walls of the passage were easily 20 feet tall and a light distance apart, and row upon row of burial chambers lined them. A thick layer of dust covered everything, including the bones of the thousands who were laid to rest here. Randomly placed jars, ornate figurines, and other decorative pottery lay throughout the hall. Beautiful frescoes depicting times of old covered both the exposed walls and the ceiling. Cobwebs hung thickly about the walls, but were strangely absent from the center of the passage. The empty eye sockets of the dead stared accusingly at them, as if asking them to quench the light and let them rest in peace. "Great," Tarek said. "Catacombs." "This must be the lowest level of the ancient city," Dartin surmised. "The great cities of Arundel are said to have miles of catacombs such as this beneath them." Which way now, Kalor? The scepter's gem then pulled them irresistibly down the south passage, its light revealing numerous doors and side passageways branching off it. Looking down, Kalor was surprised to see what looked like the impression of footprints left in the dust. Tarek, look here. The ranger inspected the tracks. You are right, Kalor. Someone walked through here very recently. By the tracks, I would say he was about 6 feet tall and lightly built, more like an elf's build than a man's build. He backtracked a bit and then continued south. This just keeps getting better, Karina said. I've got a bad feeling about this too, Dow agreed. Perhaps an old prayer will help. Dream well, elder spirits of light breezes and gentle seasons. May the living's footfalls ignite memories of dearest loves and silver beaches. Wake not, ghostly spirits. Be at ease. Be soothed and be still. Karina clutched his hand with a desperate grip, the left hand holding the hilt of the sword of the north wind. Let's get out of here, she begged. Kalor, Carmen said, lead on. Using Dow's light, they entered the passage. Dow was the last one among them to step through the doorway, and it was then that the portal suddenly slammed shut behind them. Dow rushed for the doorknob, but it would not turn despite his strongest effort. It's locked! An eerie, supernatural wind began to blow through the tunnel then, kicking up the dust and disturbing the cobwebs. Warm and dry, it reeked of age-old decay. Carmen's mind suddenly screamed out in warning. A terrible evil was approaching. How she knew it, she could not say, but she understood it as surely as the sun rises. To arms, she said. Prepare yourselves. Quickly, Kalor, head to the south. Holding the magical diamond like a beacon, he moved urgently down the passageway. He felt pursued, but by what he could not know. Perhaps it was simply their own shadows that followed them, but he knew better. Odin protects us, Dartin invoked. Pray that he does so, Leander said, for I feel now that this is the lair of some ancient evil. The wind blew stronger, and then a terrible voice echoed throughout the halls. Who dares disturb me? Rise, my children. Rise and destroy the intruders. What do you suppose he means by rise? Kalor muttered, trembling a bit in fear. Keep moving, Carmen ordered. The tunnel was long, and except for their magical light, utterly dark. Alcoves were carved into the walls in 3 high tiers that went on and on. Strange sounds began to rumble from within them, softly at first, like old bones rubbing together. What is that? Karina asked before she saw it, and screamed. Powers that could cause the dead to rise, or perhaps forces best left unknown. But in that place and in that dark hour, they did indeed rise. Every skeleton, every slumbering spirit, and every decaying corpse were among the Lich King's legions, and when their master called, they did awaken. First, he forced their wretched souls back into the vessels that had once held their lives, and such was his force of evil that their bones would organize and reform, and in a sense, reattach themselves. Their jawbones would click and settle, open and draw unbreath, and in some cases, tiny orbs of red light would appear where their eyes had once been. Their souls, with one foot in hell and the other attached to their undead corpses, could see into both worlds and could feel only one emotion, hate. Only one desire remained in them, destroy the living. Their corpses, now animate, crawled out of their resting places, slowly at first, as if they were children learning how to walk again. Their skeletal feet clicked and scratched along the stone floor, like a dull blade upon a sharpening stone. The old warriors among them armed themselves with what weapons were buried with them, while others procured clubs of bone, or sought only to grasp a living victim by the throat and strangle them. It was one of those first awakened that Karina had seen, sitting up in his dark alcove and staring. Flight was their only option, but they had traveled so far already, without food or adequate sleep, their canteens, skins, and flasks rarely full. They ran on, their hearts pounding in absolute terror. their lungs burning with swirling dust. If in that dreadful hour Kerr was their spirit, Carmen was their courage. Leading them on, she sought a place of refuge, escape, or defense. Racing down a side passage, they came upon a door made of stone. It stood ajar, with the symbol of a cross with an orb at its peak carved into its face. When their light shone within the room, the brilliant gleam of gold and riches beyond imagining tortured their eyes. Whether or not the gold gleamed only in reflection to their light or burned with a luminance all of its own was a mystery. Nonetheless, the room was as bright as a clear day in June. Within it were chests of gold and silver coins, trunks with cups and ornate chalices, and carvings of ivory and jewel-hilted daggers, gems, jewelry, priceless suits of armor, and more were displayed in all their splendor. But there was no time for further inspection, for beyond them walked the ranks of the dead. "No good," Carmen yelled. "It's a dead end. Turn back." Too late for them, for a legion of skeletal warriors now blocked the passage that they had taken. More terrible still was the sound of thousands of bony feet, walking click-clack to block their escape and bring about their end. "Go back," Dow cried. Desperate and weary, they fell back into the treasure room. Shutting the door behind them, they were surprised to find that it could be barred from within. They further bolstered it by dragging several heavy chests and setting them against it. Seconds later, the dead began slamming into it with their bone clubs, hammers of war, and other weapons, but for the moment it held against them. "What are we going to do now?" Karina said, tears welling in her eyes. "Search for a way out," Carmen said. "There may be a secret passage. Why else would the door bar from this side?" Why indeed? The treasure room. The room itself was multifaceted, consisting of 8 distinct walls, 7 of which contained deep alcoves that might conceal a doorway or hold the slaves of some long-forgotten king. A massive stone sarcophagus rested in the center of the floor, surrounded on all sides by treasure. Fanning out, they began their search. Kerr fought the urge to drown himself in the riches all around him. He tried to focus on the fact that an army of undead warriors might soon burst through the door, but it was no use. His gold fever had returned twofold, and he could not resist creeping closer to the sarcophagus and the treasure heaped around it. The pile of riches was higher than he was tall. There were platinum goblets, cups of gold, necklaces of pearls, sacks full of gems, and more, and toward these he did tread. The sarcophagus was etched with runes and symbolic portraits of yesteryear, and despite the protests of his peers, he procured one small embroidered sack. Loosening its rose-colored ties, he propped it open and reviewed its contents. And behold, it was filled with rubies, rich and red, clean and well cut. It was enough wealth to build a castle with and more. With hardly a thought, he shoved the bag inside of his tunic so that it slid down inside of it, coming to rest just above his belt. His eyes fell next upon a jewel-hilted sword, short and stout, like the blades that his people forged. Grasping it, he pulled the blade free of the mound of gold surrounding it. Its craft was exquisite, its blade wrought of mithril steel, and its handle alone was a masterwork of gold. Turning about, he intended to show the glorious blade to his friends and say, "Look, there is no curse. Let us take what we can and leave." But it was not to be, for as he turned, he saw the eyes of his friends fixed upon Dartin. Falling to his knees, Dartin cried out in agony. Writhing in unspeakable pain, he fell to the floor, convulsing. He gasped as he was overcome by a sudden transformation. Where Dartin's face had been, only a beautiful woman's remained, elfin, yet with larger eyes of azure, high cheekbones, perfect teeth, and hair of midnight blue. She drew breath in surprise, as if it was her very first breath. The armor had reformed as well, and where once the breastplate of a man had been, only the cuirass of a woman remained. Perfect of form, she slowly rose to her feet. "At last," she said, "I am alive!" "Look!" Karina screamed. "D'Artain is there!" And indeed he was, standing at the back of the room, stark naked and bewildered, looking at his hands and arms as if wondering how he had come to be there. "Kneel before your queen," the Chaos Maiden commanded, and such was her voice that they nearly complied, for here before them was a living god. They did not kneel, however, for they were not the naive children formerly ruled by the Chaos Lords. Nay, they were firmen, and they knelt only before their own king. "Perhaps you should kneel before us," Carmen said, with her blazing bow drawn. "I have a hunch that this weapon can do you no small harm." "You dare to wield my own bow against me?" "I do." "Infidels," she cursed. "Without me, none of you will ever leave this place alive." Carmen could stand no more. The presence of evil was so thick around her that her mind screamed out to act not, save to destroy it. If there would be any chance for them to defeat this ancient evil, it would be now, before she regained her full strength. Her companions were of like mind, for they stood with weapons drawn and determined visage. Loosing her arrow, she struck the Chaos Maiden. Blackened and pitted, the Vanir armor held against it. Kalor hurled his dagger, but she merely raised her hand, blocking it with magic or some force of her will. With a word, she raised a shining barrier around herself and drew the sword of the guardian of the south wind. A fine blade, befitting of a queen. "Give me the Seeker Stone and the gem of the staff, or I shall kill you all," she commanded. "Never," Carmen said. Their combat joined. Their concentration was locked upon Sheena, a nemesis the likes of which they had never known. It was because of this that they did not readily notice the sinister presences all around them. The dead rise. They had slept for centuries, entombed in their golden beds. Eons ago, they had been members of an elite guard, sworn to defend the life of their king, an elven lord named Andamar Tabaroon. Their oaths bade them to follow him when he fell into darkness. In death they waited, guardians through the ages, waiting until the day might come when their tortured souls could move on. In the meantime, all life was a thing they despised. Life, so unnatural to the dead, required destruction, despoilment. Their kingdom needed warriors, and only the dead need apply. Their treasure disturbed, their restful sleep was broken. Sheena moved toward Carmen, clearly intending to cut down all within her path, but something stopped her. Looking to her left, she stared at the sarcophagus. Its lid was sliding open. Inch by inch it slid, stone grinding upon stone. At times the sliding ceased, only to resume a moment later. When it had opened enough, 5 bony fingers rose up to grasp the lid more firmly and then hurl it aside, as if it weighed little more than a child's toy. It sailed past Kerr, who was nearly decapitated, only to be shattered against the wall behind him. The ragged cloth-wrapped fingers then turned to grasp the lip of the chest, and then a second pair did take hold of its opposite side. Everyone among them was transfixed with horror. Up and up it rose, the cloth-wrapped form of some long-dead corpse. It possessed the size and shape of the men of old, with wide, powerful shoulders and tall stature. No more was this creature one of the living. Its once muscular shoulders were now only a memory. Its flesh was dried and sunken, its arms merely bones and desiccated skin beneath rotten ancient trappings. When its eyelids opened, like leather slits left in contact with each other for too long, 2 burning orbs of rage brought their wrath to bear. Turning its hateful attention first upon the being that had defiled its burial riches, it stood in a jagged fashion, as if its bones had to adjust to the horrific power that moved them. For this monster was not driven by mortal forces. Nay, this creature was empowered by the limitless realm of death. Its strength was despair, its body a parody of life. Here were the ancient dead guardians of legend. Here was the terrible mummy, an unstoppable vehicle of rage, a trapped soul corrupted by evil. Kerr was frozen by a fear greater than any he had ever known. Never in his wildest nightmares had he imagined that such a thing could exist, for who could be man enough to create such a being? He could not act. Helplessly frozen by its hungry stare, he felt the weight of the sword in his hands and the pressure of the rubies against his stomach. "I'll put it back the way that it was," he thought, but he knew that it was too late. The mummy's curse sprung. He was soon to be its next victim. Watching in fascination as the skeletal legs stepped forth from the coffin, he stared on in horror as the 7-foot-tall hulk shambled inexorably toward him. He wanted to run, but he could do nothing. The mummy's arm rose up above him, and he knew that he was witnessing the moment of his death. Never again would he see his kin. Never again would he taste his father's mushroom wine. Something within him, perhaps some tiny vestige that remained of his own will, caused him to drop the treasure sword and seek out the handle of his axe. In a rush, power flowed back into his limbs. The mummy's arm descended, and at the final instant he rolled clear, crashing into a chaotic mass of treasure. The mummy cried out in rage, and its voice was a hollow moan, an ancient parody of what had once been the voice of a man. Kerr meant to join his companions and escape, but it was not preordained. The very walls were coming alive. There were 7 dark alcoves in that cursed room, and each was issuing forth an undead creature all of its own. In seconds, they suddenly faced 8 monsters, each just as terrible as the first. That's where we'll end episode 25 and begin episode 26 on page 322. And we'll see if Carmen and her rangers can survive the curse of the undead. And as always, remember to read Kerr's Rage, Part 1 of the Duaredheim Staff Saga, followed by The Drums of Doom, Part 2. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed it. Have a great night.